I was driving on I-85 highway when I pulled off at 9:45 because my GPS had been recalculating for 20 minutes and the fuel gauge was not functioning properly. It was not empty. Not even close to empty, but the needle had been sitting in the same position for too long without the movement that normally accompanies driving, the kind of stillness in a gauge that suggests there is some technical problem, and I did not want to be wrong about that on a stretch of 2-lane highway in rural Georgia where the next marked fuel stop was 40 miles ahead. The town I pulled into was not on my GPS. I want to be specific about that because it matters. The GPS had been showing me as traveling through empty county geography for the previous 12 miles. No towns, no services, no markers of any kind, and then there was a town. A gas station at the junction where the county road met the state highway, a main street visible beyond it with buildings on both sides, lights on in most of them despite the late hour, vehicles parked along the street. A town that my mapping software did not know existed. I pulled into the gas station, and the pump was operational and accepted my card, and I filled the tank while looking at the main street ahead of me. The town had the specific character of rural Georgia in a way that was immediately legible. Brick storefronts from the mid-20th century, a water tower visible above the roofline on the far end, a church steeple catching the available moonlight. Nothing unusual in its physical character. I finished fueling and went inside the gas station to use the restroom and buy coffee, which was the sum total of my intentions at that point. The woman behind the counter was in her 60s, and she looked up when I came in with a specific assessing look of someone who lived in a place small enough that a stranger's face was immediately registerable. I said good evening, and she said it back, and I found the coffee station and poured a cup and brought it to the counter. She told me the price and I paid, and she gave me change and said nothing further, which was fine and entirely normal for a late-night gas station interaction. I was at the door about to leave when she said something. She said, without any particular emphasis or tone change, that I should be back on the highway before 10. I turned around and looked at her, and she was looking at me with an expression that was neutral in a way that felt calibrated rather than natural. I asked her what she meant. She said the roads got difficult after 10. I told her I'd just come in on the county road and it seemed fine. She said she meant the roads through town, that there was sometimes traffic after 10 that made the main street difficult to navigate, and that if I was passing through, it was better to be on the highway before then. I looked at the clock on the wall behind her, 9:52. I thanked her and went back to my car. I should have gotten back on the highway. I understand that, in retrospect, with a clarity that I did not have in the moment, and the reason I did not have it in the moment was that what she had said was both specific enough to register as a genuine warning and vague enough that I could not identify what I was being warned about. Traffic after 10 on a main street in a town this small on a Tuesday night was not a threat category I was equipped to take seriously. I sat in my car at the gas station for a moment, and I looked at the main street, and I made the decision to drive through it rather than take the highway bypass that ran around the town's north side. I turned onto the main street at 9:55. The street was 4 blocks long, and I could see the far end from the gas station junction, where the county road continued south on the other side of town. 4 blocks. I estimated 2 minutes to drive it at the pace you drove a small town main street. I would be on the South County Road well before 10. I was at the second block when the people came out, not dramatically, not all at once, in the way that people emerge from buildings when something has been scheduled, in groups of 2 and 3 from the shop doors on both sides of the street, from the spaces between buildings, from a side street visible on my left. Adults, mostly, with some older teenagers, none of them children. They were moving toward the center of the main street with the specific purposeful quality of people who knew where they were going and why. They were not running. They were not agitated. They were moving with the calm intentionality of people fulfilling an obligation they had fulfilled before. I slowed my car to a stop because the street ahead of me was filling with people, and continuing at any speed was not possible. I sat behind the wheel and watched them through the windshield. They were not looking at my car. They were not looking at me. They were looking in the direction of the far end of the main street, the south end, where something was happening that I could not yet see clearly. I looked at the clock on my dashboard. 10 o'clock exactly. I put my window down slightly to hear what was happening, and what I heard was silence. Not the silence of nothing occurring. The silence of a large group of people who are completely quiet together, which is a specific and unusual quality of sound that I had not experienced before and that I found immediately and profoundly unsettling. 60 or 80 people standing in the street and none of them speaking. None of them making any sound at all. At the south end of the main street, visible now that a sufficient number of people had positioned themselves and I could see over and between them, there was a gathering around something I could not fully identify. A structure of some kind in the intersection at the south end of the street, low and wide, visible in the street light above the intersection. Not a vehicle. Not furniture. Something that had been placed there, or that had been there, that I had not registered when I looked down the street from the gas station junction, because at that distance and in that light, it had simply read as part of the intersection's infrastructure. The people in the street were oriented toward this structure with their backs to me and their faces toward the south end. Nobody was paying attention to my car idling in the second block. Nobody was acknowledging my presence in any way. The collective attention was entirely on whatever was happening at the south end of the main street, and that collective attention had the quality of something witnessed rather than something participated in, which produced in me the additional specific unease of not knowing whether I was witnessing the same thing they were witnessing or whether I was the thing being witnessed. I made a 3-point turn in the street. This required me to pull partially onto the sidewalk to the right and then back toward the left side before straightening. And during the 3-point turn, I was briefly facing the sidewalk on my right, and I saw a man standing there, on the sidewalk, outside a hardware store that was dark and closed. He was watching me, not watching the south end of the street where everyone else was oriented, watching my car. He was in his 40s, wearing a work jacket, standing completely still on the sidewalk, watching me complete my turn with an expression I could not fully read, but that had none of the collective calm of the people in the street. His expression had attention in it, specific attention, the kind that meant he knew I was turning around and was tracking the fact of it. I completed the turn and drove north back toward the gas station junction, and I did not look in my rearview mirror until I was off the main street and turning onto the highway bypass north of town. In the mirror, the main street was visible as a lit corridor with the shapes of the people in it still standing in their collective orientation toward the south end, still silent. As far as I could tell from that distance and at that speed, I was on the highway heading south in under 4 minutes from the moment I had started my 3-point turn. The town disappeared behind me quickly in the way that small towns disappear on a highway at speed, visible for a moment as a cluster of lights in the dark landscape and then gone. The GPS showed me traveling through empty county geography again. No town, no marker, nothing. I drove another 60 miles before I stopped for the night. At a chain hotel on a well-lit interstate interchange with other guests visible in the parking lot and a front desk clerk who talked too much and whom I was genuinely grateful for. I called my wife from the room before I unpacked, and I told her I had stopped for the night and where I was and that I was fine, and she said good and asked if everything was okay because I sounded a certain way, and I said I was just tired. I checked my GPS history the following morning to look for any record of the route through the town. The GPS showed my route on the highway for the stretch where I had actually been on the county road, with a gap in the tracking that corresponded to approximately the 20 minutes I had spent off the highway, including the fuel stop and the main street drive. The gap in the GPS record was not unusual in itself. GPS signal dropped in rural areas regularly, but the gap covered exactly the period I had been in the town that the map showed as empty county geography. I do not have an explanation for the town's absence from my GPS mapping. I do not have an explanation for what was happening on the main street at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night in a place that mapping software did not know existed. I do not have an explanation for the man on the sidewalk who was watching my car instead of the south end of the street, or for what his specific attention toward my turning vehicle meant about what he understood was happening and what he expected to happen next. What I have is the gas station woman's voice telling me to be back on the highway before 10, with the specific quality of someone delivering a genuine warning in the most indirect form available to them, and the fact that I was back on the highway at 3 minutes past 10, which was close enough that I'm glad I made the 3-point turn when I did rather than 60 seconds later. My car broke down at 11 at night on a state highway in rural Mississippi, and I want to be specific about what broke down and when because it matters. It was the alternator. That is what the dashboard was telling me when the warning light came on, and within about 4 miles of drive, my car had lost enough electrical function that I pulled over rather than risk losing headlights on a 2-lane Mississippi highway with no shoulder lighting. I pulled onto the grass at the road edge and sat there with my hazard lights on for about 3 minutes while I decided what to do, and then I looked up the road ahead of me and saw lights. Not headlights. The ambient glow of a small town visible over a slight rise in the road maybe half a mile ahead. I got out of the car, locked it, and walked toward the lights, which is a decision I made in about 15 seconds. The town was not large. A main junction where the state highway crossed a county road, a general store on one corner that was closed, a diner on the opposite corner that was also closed, a small motel on the south side of the junction that had its office light on, and a scattering of residential streets visible going east and west with the specific, modest character of a rural Mississippi community that existed at this junction because the junction existed rather than for any other reason. No gas station. No mechanic. Nothing that addressed my immediate practical needs except the motel, which at least addressed the immediate need for somewhere to be while I figured out the rest. The motel office had a man behind the desk who was in his 60s and who was awake and alert in a way that suggested he had not been asleep when I came in, which was notable for 11 on a Tuesday night. He told me his name was Raymond and he had a room available and the rate was $42 a night, which I paid, and I told him about my car on the highway. He said he would have someone take a look at it in the morning, that there was a man in town who worked on vehicles and who could be reached, and that in the meantime the car would be fine where it was because nothing happened on that road at night. He said the last part in a way that was meant to be reassuring, and that landed somewhere slightly differently. My room was a standard motel room facing the junction. I could see the junction from my window, and I stood at it for a moment after Raymond had gone back to his office and looked at the junction in the available lighting. Empty. A stop sign, a street light, the 4 corners of the junction showing their respective closed businesses. I went to bed. I woke at approximately 7 the following morning to a knock on my door. It was Raymond, with coffee in a paper cup, which was an unexpectedly hospitable gesture that I accepted with genuine gratitude. He told me the mechanic, whose name was Curtis, would come by at 9 to look at the car. He said it as though he had already spoken to Curtis, which meant he had called him before 9 in the morning, which meant he had called him before I had confirmed I wanted him to, which was a small detail and which I noted and set aside. Curtis arrived at 8:50 with a flatbed truck and a specific professional competence that made the car situation feel manageable. He diagnosed the alternator immediately and said he could have it done by end of day if the part was available, that he would need to call around. He towed the car to his shop on the East Residential Street, and I walked back to the motel to wait. What I did during the waiting was the kind of thing you do when you are stuck somewhere unexpectedly. I walked the town. It was small enough to walk completely in about 20 minutes, the junction at its center and the residential streets radiating from it in 4 directions, maybe 150 homes, a small church, an elementary school that was not in session, a community building with its parking lot empty. The people I encountered on the residential streets were uniformly polite. "Good morning, how are you?" The standard small-town pedestrian exchange. Several of them knew I was the person whose car had broken down the previous night, which was the specific speed of small-town information movement that I had encountered before and which did not in itself seem unusual. By noon, I had a sense of the town that was pleasant and straightforward. Small, functional, friendly in the genuine way of places that had not been self-consciously cultivated for outside consumption. I had lunch at the diner, which was open for the midday meal, and the woman who ran it gave me a piece of pie that I had not ordered and did not charge me for, which I took as the hospitality of a community that was making a stranded traveler feel welcome. At 3 in the afternoon, Curtis called Raymond's motel office. Because I had given Raymond the number since my cell signal was too weak for reliable calls, and Raymond walked to my room to tell me that the part was not available locally and would need to be ordered, arriving the following morning, which pushed the repair to the following afternoon at the earliest. One more night. I accepted this, and Raymond said dinner was available at the diner until 8, and that he would walk over with me at 6 if I wanted company, which was a slightly unusual offer that I accepted because I did not have a strong reason not to. Dinner with Raymond was fine. He was a man of specific but limited conversational range, comfortable talking about the town's history and its residents, and less comfortable talking about anything beyond the junction and its surrounding streets. When I asked him about the highway and where it went, he answered with the specific brevity of someone who did not find that direction of conversation interesting, and when I asked about what was north of the town, where I had come from, he said there was not much and changed the subject to the history of the diner building, which had been something else before it was a diner. I noted the subject changes, and I did not press them. I went back to my room at 8, and I was settling in for the night when I noticed something about the room that had not been the case when I left it for dinner. My bag, which I had left on the luggage rack with its zipper partially open in the specific, careless way I always left it in motel rooms, was on the bed, zipped closed, positioned in the center of the bed as though it had been placed there rather than moved there accidentally. I stood in the room doorway and looked at it, and then I went in and opened the bag and checked its contents. Everything was there. Nothing was missing. The bag had been moved and searched and replaced, was my conclusion, and I held that conclusion for approximately 5 minutes while I looked at the bag in the room and thought about what to do with it. I went to Raymond's office. He was behind the desk with a local newspaper, and he looked up when I came in with his standard expression of attentive helpfulness, which was the expression he had worn consistently since the previous night, and which I was looking at differently now. I told him my bag had been moved in my room. He said housekeeping had probably shifted it when they tidied up. I told him the bag had been moved from the luggage rack to the bed and zipped closed, and that I had not left it zipped. He said he was sorry for the disturbance and that he would speak to the housekeeper. He said it with the practiced ease of someone delivering a prepared explanation, and the practiced ease was the specific detail that told me the explanation was prepared. I went back to my room and I locked the door, and I thought about the bag and Raymond's prepared explanation and the subject changes at dinner when I asked about the highway north. And I thought about the people on the residential streets who had already known about my car before I had spoken to any of them except Raymond, which meant Raymond had told them, which meant Raymond had distributed the information about me to the community before I had been there long enough to distribute it myself. I thought about what it meant for a small town to know about a stranded traveler immediately and completely, and to offer hospitality that was structured in specific ways, and to have a motel operator who offered to walk you to dinner rather than simply directing you there, and to have a mechanic whose part delivery timeline extended your stay by a day. I thought about these things, and I could not make them add up to anything I was comfortable with, even though none of them individually was something I could point to as definitively wrong. At 11 that night, I was still awake when I heard something outside my room door. Not a knock. A slow movement of the door handle, a testing of it, the specific sound of someone checking whether a door was locked rather than intending to knock and enter. The handle moved once and stopped. I lay completely still. The handle did not move again. I got up and I packed my bag completely in the dark, working by touch and memory, and I put my shoes on and I sat on the edge of the bed and I thought about what I was going to do. My car was at Curtis's shop on the East Residential Street, 2 blocks from the motel, with no key in the ignition because I had my keys, and an alternator that did not function well enough to get me anywhere useful. The highway was half a mile north with no cars on it at this hour. I thought about Raymond's comment from the previous night, that nothing happened on that road at night. I thought about how specifically that was worded, not that the road was safe or that there was no traffic. that nothing happened, which was a statement about events rather than conditions, and which I was understanding now as something closer to a guarantee than a reassurance. I went to the window and looked at the junction. Empty. Stop sign, street light, 4 corners. I looked at the motel office window and the light was on, which meant Raymond was at his desk at 11 at night. I looked at the residential streets visible from my window and I could see, on the east street, a light on in a house that I had noticed earlier in the day had its porch light off, which was now on. On the west street, a vehicle that I did not recognize from my afternoon walk was parked at the end of the block in a position that faced the motel. I went to the bathroom window, which faced the south side of the property away from the junction, and I opened it as quietly as I could manage. The south side of the property was dark and faced a residential backyard with a fence at the far edge. I climbed out through the bathroom window onto the ground, which was a distance of about 4 feet, and I landed on the grass of the south property and moved toward the fence at the back. I went over the fence and through the backyard beyond it and came out on the south residential street, 1 block south of the junction. I turned west and walked 2 blocks and then north, coming back to the state highway from the west side of the junction rather than through it, which put me on the highway shoulder heading north without having walked through the junction itself. I walked north on the highway shoulder for approximately 1.5 miles before a vehicle appeared, a pickup heading north, and I put out my hand and the truck stopped. The driver was a man in his 40s who was heading to a town 20 miles north and who had the uncomplicated manner of someone who had not been briefed about me or my situation. He asked where I was going and I said north and he said get in. I left my car at Curtis's shop and I left my second night's payment unpaid and I left without telling Raymond I was leaving, and I did not look back at the junction as the truck moved north on the highway. I called a family member from the passenger seat of the truck once my cell signal returned and I arranged for the car to be recovered by a service that could handle it remotely. The car was retrieved 2 days later and the alternator was fixed by a shop in a city and I paid for it without returning to the town.